Hike began in Wyoming, north of Steamboat Springs. If you've ever been to Steamboat Springs, you know what this sign's about. But we parked one vehicle at Rabbit Ears Pass and then drove the other up into Wyoming and hiked back to the vehicle at Rabbit Ears Pass. In Wyoming, we were greeted by swarms of butterflies and a beautiful evening to start our hike. First evening, Don and I hiked about 3 miles, which led us to camp at a small water source right near the Colorado border. And next day we got up and crossed into Colorado from Wyoming.
Colorado-Wyoming border, sort of. I think it's a little off. What is it? Anybody know what this is on the trees? Seems to be on a lot of them. Seems to be killing them off.
First day of the trip, we were hiking along the northern part of Mount Zirkel Wilderness. Had gorgeous views into the wilderness and just a beautiful day of hiking to begin. Colorado had a wet year so far, and that had led to just some gorgeous wildflowers. Tried to identify as many as I could. I have an app on my phone that I use to do that. I can't guarantee everything I've written in this video is accurate, but I did the best I could.
Trying to stay ahead of that. Everywhere else is beautiful. Waiting out a rainstorm.
Luckily, Don had brought his tarp along. We had seen the storm following behind us, and just before it got to us, we set it up real quick. We were able to take shelter during the worst of the storm, and then as it eased off, we just put on our rain gear and kept hiking. Eventually, we came to a creek crossing where the bridge had been washed out. Made for an interesting time to try to find some way to cross. Did find some logs laying across the river that allowed us to get to the other side. But then as we began hiking on the other side, we found that there had been no trail maintenance done on this for quite some time. So I believe the CDT is probably being rerouted around this washout, and would not recommend coming through this part We actually probably got more wet from squeezing in between all the low-hanging leaves and branches and overgrowth on the trail here than we did when the rainstorm came through.
This could use some maintenance.
After finding our way through that difficult part, we then came across a large sheep herd, domestic sheep, and decided we needed to keep hiking for a while as they were very loud and we did not want to sleep near them. So we pushed on for about 20 miles this day. Next morning had been kind of a damp morning, so we woke up to wet tents, so we kind of had to dry off, but pretty clear skies and a nice morning. And we headed out on the trail. Unfortunately, the previous day on a steep part, Donnie kind of hurt his knee a little bit, and so our pace was a little slower this day, and we only wound up achieving about 9 miles this day because his knee was worn out at that point. Since our gear was still wet from the night before, we decided to find a little spot to stop and lay it all out to dry it out as the day warmed up. At this point, we began to enter Mount Zirkel Wilderness for real. Third burn scar that we'd hiked through on this hike already. Interesting how many fires had burned, but they burned at different times, so it's also interesting to see the various stages of recovery. This one seemed to be fairly recent, as there were very few trees that had recovered from it, and a lot of the dead standing still in place. We did see 3 moose on this trip. This is the only photo I got of one. Stopped pretty early this day, about 1:30 I believe it was, but it really wound up working out well, as the higher ground we were heading for at the time was in some pretty dark clouds, and probably just best we stopped there. Started off early the next day and were able to get over the exposed ridges before any weather came up. We were stopped, I decided to take a little walk around the lake that we were camping nearby and visit the area, but of course found a Mylar balloon and some trash laying around. Cleaned that up, but Mylar balloons that I find in the wilderness are just a little pet peeve of mine. So tried to lay down and listen to an audiobook, but the mosquitoes made that tough to do without covering up everything. Fortunately, some rain picked up and helped knock them down a bit, but that sent me to my tent. Next day was a beautiful morning, a little cool, but no frost or anything, and was predicted to be a nicer day than we've had so far on the trail. It started with an uphill climb, and not long into it we could see the ridge ahead that we had to ascend to get to the top of Lost Ranger Peak. climb quickly gave us some great views of the Mount Zirkel Wilderness to the north of us, and also gave us a great view down into the valley where we'd been the day before. The top of Lost Ranger Peak also gave us a great place to dry our stuff out. Continental Divide Trail sees a lot less traffic than the Colorado Trail does. So many times the trail fades out pretty dramatically and you have to keep an open eye on where it goes to make sure you don't lose the trail. Even though we were doing this hike at the very end of July, there was still a decent snowfield we had to cross. Nothing too big to be worried about. It was pretty flat, but kind of fun to be hiking on snow late in the year.
That's the trail.
It's fun to run across this pair of elk high in the mountains. The things that keeps me going on these long days of hiking is getting a good foot soak in to help those feet feel rested and ready to go for the next 10 miles.
Yeah, 8.4 I think it said. It's the IKEA cairn. You have to put it together yourself.
The area we were entering had bands of growth in the trees that made it look like ski areas. This is well into the middle of the wilderness, not an area ski areas ever developed. This, I believe, is a natural phenomenon, either caused by some of the rock layers just beneath the dirt or possibly from the wind loading of snow. Very interesting to look at, and went on for miles and miles. And we did cross through another burn scar. towards the end of this day, we began chasing a thunderstorm instead of being in front of one. We didn't wind up getting hit by it at all, but eventually did wind up in an area where the hail had fallen. By this morning, the hail had all melted away, and we retreated to a beautiful sunrise and a great hike out.
Someday I'm going to show Don what those trekking poles are for.
Back to Rabbit Ears Pass, where my vehicle was parked a little after noon that day. Then headed into Steamboat Springs, grabbed some pizza before a 2-hour drive up to Wyoming again to retrieve Don's car, and then our 5-hour journey back home. It's been a great hike, 65 miles through some of Colorado's greatest beauty.